Hi, I'm Peter Westmoreland. Let me tell you about my book, Hand and World. Here we are, Hand and World. So, let me tell you a little bit about who I am, first of all. I teach at St. Petersburg College in Florida. I have an email with the name John in it because that's my first name, but nobody calls me that. Call me Peter. But if you want to reach me, this is the email. I have a website, I have a podcast. I am the former president of the Florida Philosophical Association and former president of the Lighthearted Philosopher Society. If you have heard of me before, it is probably through early modern philosophy. I've published quite a bit on Rousseau and Descartes in particular. I really like this paper I wrote about Descartes in race. If you're looking for racism ideas prior to Kant, check that one out. And I have this podcast that is about philosophy in the 90s. It's called Exile in 90sville. If you just search Peter Westmoreland in Apple Music or Spotify, you will find that. It's me talking about 90s stuff and then interviewing folks who were there or have some expertise, including a number of philosophers like Laurie Schrag, Steve Gimbel, to give their insights on the decade and what was going on there. But you are here for a Handedness book. So, how handedness shapes lived experience, intersectionality, and inequality, hand and world. That is a mess of SEO keywords that they told me I should put in the title of my book so that people would search for it. What does it mean? Well, here's the deal. This is the first philosophy book about handedness, about being left handed, right handed, stuff like that. I don't know why, but here we are. First one. It's got a number of ideas in it. Uh, But why even talk about this? Well, the first chapter, why does handedness matter? Well, there's a potential for pernicious inequalities. About 10 to 15% of persons worldwide are left handed. Left handed people are a minority in all cultures. Some cultures really stigmatize left handedness. In the West, here, places are not so bad as they used to be, but still, there's stigmatization of left handers. And some of the stigmatization involves intersections with ethnicity and gender, so it's really worth paying attention to. And handedness is a fundamental element of the human condition. Your life and your environment around you are so deeply set according to your handedness. It's very difficult to capture all the ways that your handedness matters. I mean, just look at the device in front of you that you're using for this. It is right-handed, I promise. We know there's a lot of right-hand bias. That's just a basic fact when you live in a world that's 90% right-handed, but we don't know a lot about it. Left-handed people tend not to be studied or studied well, and the science of handedness itself is biased, which I'll get into here in a minute. So this is a book in two parts. The first part is largely theoretical. The second part is applied stuff. So in the theory stuff, you've got questions like what is handedness? I even talk about like what is a hand? What is right hand bias? What are the norms that govern it? So some of that kind of work going on, and really sort of difficult questions about how we can distinguish left and right at all. Not all animals can do that. And then in the applied part, I've got a chapter on throwing. Really, it's about handedness and athletic performance. If you make it through this stuff about distinguishing left and right, you deserve something a little fun there. Then we've got some work about intersections of gender and handedness norms and sexual orientation, and how they provide constraints on movement. Talk about harms of handedness, ask the question if left-handed people are oppressed, and then some liberal democratic theory. We don't typically think about handedness as having anything to do with that, but it turns out has a lot to do with it. So, looking at the theory, getting into chapter two of the book, let's start with the science. And that's what I had to do because, after all, there is no philosophy of handedness. I mean, maybe, right, you've heard of Kant's incongruent counterparts or something like that, but that's not about handedness, right? Uh, but there is a science of handedness. And this is also where I started in this journal Laterality, this interdisciplinary academic journal. It's really excellent. It's really interesting. People who work on handedness tend to be really interdisciplinary. A lot of crosstalk across history, cognitive psychology, biology, sociology, psychology, all over the place, right? So I found this journal. And I actually went digging in there to see if there was a philosopher who was doing work on handedness. This was like 15 years ago. I couldn't find anybody. And so I just cold emailed the editor to see if he knew any philosophers who were working on it. And he said, no. Why don't you do it? And I said, well, I have to finish my dissertation, but I'll get there. And I finally did. We have to start with what scientists are saying about handedness in the first place, really, because that's our source. So, what do they think about handedness? Well, they think pretty much the same thing that you think. That handedness is a matter of which hand you use for everyday common activities. That's what it means to say somebody's left-handed. They use their left hand for writing, drawing, throwing, right, using a knife, whatever, right? Uh, they, of course, think about it with a little more complexity. They use things like this one, the Edinburgh Handedness Inventory, or other similar things where you're saying which hand you use, how strong the preference is, if you ever use the other hand, and they'll put it into some computation and spit out a number that puts you on a spectrum between being totally consistently left-handed or totally consistently right-handed. You can use this link for an easy one of these to take if you would like to assess yourself. Probably you're consistently right-handed, but you know, check it out. Uh, I call this the hand use model of handedness or hum, right? Where handedness is just a matter of which hand you use across a variety of daily activities. That's the scientific model of handedness. That's the folk model of handedness. But I think it has problems, right? So, how I got into this really is by thinking about this model that takes hand use as definitive of handedness and contesting it. So, how'd your Edinburgh handedness inventory go? I'm sure you paused it. Take a second to look at it. If not, pause it now, come back. Well, how accurate do you feel like it was? It was probably pretty accurate if you are right-handed. Right-handed people are almost never misclassified when they take one of these things. But left-handed people are misclassified as right-handed 13 to 14% of the time. That's a significant differences in results between left-handed people and right-handed people. And what it means, of course, is that testing this way is right-hand biased. And that's how I got here. I was in graduate school. I was interested in learning about handedness while I was working on Rousseau and other things. And so I took this survey and it told me I was right-handed, and that is not true. I am very much left-handed. I would never think of myself as being right-handed in any way, but sometimes when I take these things, it says I'm right-handed because I use my right hand for a lot of the things I do, which is pretty common for left-handed people because we live in a right-handed world and you have to adapt yourself to it. So, how can we talk about that? Well, first of all, it made me a little concerned about what was going on in the science if the science was relying on these ideas. And I coined some terminology. So, dextrocentrism, the world is designed for encounter with the right hand. Dexteronormativity, one should encounter the world with the right hand, not in a moral sense, right? But just because that's the way you're going to be more effective. So, if you look around your world at the things that you have, they are designed for being used by right-handed people. Just pick anything in your world, you'll see that it's set up that way. Or maybe in a sort of neutral way, depending on how you think about it. And then, of course, when we're talking about bimanual things, uh, you'll see, functions set for the left or for the right because you got to do a lot of things, right? But in general, the world is set up for being right-handed. I mean, I have never owned a microwave that didn't have the number pad on the right side, right? There's nothing controversial about this. Everyone knows the world is biased for right-handers. That's what the scissors are for, right? That's why you have the left-handed scissors, because we all know that things are made for right-handed people. So, non-controversial claim, what's the point here? Well, here's where we get to something that is a big deal. So, I put it this way. The hand use model conceptualizes handedness according to hand use. Hand use is systematically biased toward the right hand through dextrocentrism and dextronormativity. So, Hum conceptualizes handedness uh, according to right hand biased hand use. This means Hum's concept of handedness is right hand biased. So, we might say because of its reliance on hand use, Hume's concept of handedness confuses handedness with right-handedness. Or putting it another way, studying which hand someone uses is a good way to find right-handers, but it's not so good for left-handers. Hand use may be a good way to conceptualize right-handedness, but not left-handedness, and certainly not handedness in general. What are we saying here? If your model of what it is to be handed is which hand you use, well, that's really good for right-handed people because most right-handed people are consistently right-handed, right? But if your model for what handedness is hand use, it's not going to be good for finding left-handed people because left-handed people don't use their hands the same way right-handed people do. It's going to miscategorize them. It's going to make them look less left-handed than they actually are. And it's not just the use, it's the concept itself. If you base the concept in hand use, then you're getting the wrong idea of what it is to be handed for that percentage of the population that's not consistently right-handed because they're using both hands. So what does this mean? Why do I say it's a big deal? Well, it's not just the assessment of handedness by hand use that's a problem. It's the concept that's a problem. And this is the basic concept of handedness on which all folk and scientific understandings of handedness rest. The basic concept of handedness that is used everywhere, all the time, by all human beings for everything is right hand biased. All research, because the research is based in this model, is right hand biased. It confuses handedness and right handedness. It treats them like the same thing, like they can be assessed in the same way. So we don't really know what handedness is. We don't really know what left handedness is. That's a big deal that we have this idea of handedness and we've always had it wrong forever. And no, wait, this really is a big deal. No one has disputed my findings since my first article in 2017. My work has undermined the meaning of handedness since the dawn of time for everyone, everywhere. I don't super like tooting my own horn like this, but like I did this. It's out there. I would love to get some other ideas, but there are no other ideas. There is no competing definition of handedness. No one knows what handedness is. And as the only philosopher who's written a book about this stuff, I'm really on an island about it, which I don't like. But press on we must. So, in the next chapter, I outline a different approach to thinking about handedness, and it's thinking through spatiality more generally. So, what I propose, I call the spatial orientation model of handedness. The handedness is a matter of how one moves one's hands in space, not just a matter of the hand one uses. And thinking handedness as a matter of body schematization, sort of building here out of Merleau-Ponty's understanding of how body schemas work, which I'll talk about more a little later. So that's the model that I think is, if it's not the correct model, it's certainly a better one. And there are good reasons for us to think about handedness this way. So one reason, there are differing left and right-handed body comportments. There is compelling evidence that left and right-handed persons use their bodies differently, move their bodies differently. And it shows up in a couple of different ways. So, quantitative. Before we get to this slide, here's an idea. Do you have some Legos somewhere in your house, flat, whatever? Lay them down on a table, just sort of randomly, and build a tower with them. Thanks for coming back after building an awesome tower. So, how did it go? Here's something that empirical data has shown over and over again. Right-handed people will build the entire tower by reaching out for the Legos with their right hands. Left-handed people will alternate. If the bricks are on the left side, they'll pick them up with their left hand. If the bricks are on the right side, they'll pick them up with their right hand. What does this mean? This means that left-handed people use their right hands far more likely, left-handed people use their right hands far more often than right-handed people use their left hands. Right-handed people are really consistently right-handed. Left-handed people are inconsistently handed, as they put it. So we've got a quantitative difference in the hands, right? In which hand is being used. But there are also qualitative differences. And you can really see this idea if you look at these two guys, right? And I don't know what your politics are. I don't really care. at this point, but whatever you think of this guy on the left, Barack Obama, his handwriting is a mess. Look at his arms sticking out to the side, the hooked wrist. And whatever you think of this guy on the right, George W. Bush, his handwriting is excellent. That straight wrist, the elbow tucked into the side of the body, really beautiful, right? If you were going to teach a kid how to write, you would show them the picture of George W. Bush, hands down. So these are two people doing the same thing in the same place. But the way they do it is really different. And we can find a growing body of empirical evidence for differences in movement between left and right handers. Those two guys are emblematic of it. That writing posture that you might remember from grade school is emblematic of it. Left handers have those elbows out. They work in an open posture. Right-handers keep those elbows in. They work from a closed posture. The fundamental ways that left and right-handed people reach out into the world, grasping things, bringing them to their bodies as a mode of sensory understanding, they have different ways of doing it. That's kind of a big deal. So, is it a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal. Let's talk through. What is it like? How do we see these things happen? Well, think about Western formal dining. Americans sitting around a dining room table. First of all, that table is rectangular. Second of all, they are in closed postures. They are forced to sit in close proximity next to each other where you keep your elbows in and your hands to yourself. This is a classic example of spatial orientation model of handedness. The setting isn't right-handed because the knife and the spoon are on the right side. The setting is right-handed because you're supposed to use your whole body the way right-handed people do, with your posture small. And so I have a left-handed cousin. Of course, I'm left-handed. I don't think I needed to say that. I've got this left-handed cousin. They would make us sit next to each other so we wouldn't bump into other people, and he would bump into me all the time, bringing his elbow up into my shoulder because left-handed people just operate from open postures. You can't even line us up together. The whole setup of that table is for small, closed posture bodies. Let's talk about handshaking. Okay. You like handshaking, right? At least you tolerate it. It's so confusing the way people do this. But if you watch how people shake hands, they actually line up their hands so that they are directly across from each other. So their chests are offset so that the hands are directly across from each other. That is a closed posture. You don't stick your elbow out and cross your body to shake somebody's hand. You stand offset. I can't tell you how weird this is as a left-handed person. I didn't understand how people shake hands until I was like 30 years old. Or take another behavior like throwing, right? So we'll talk more about throwing in a little bit here. Obviously, left-handed people can throw, um, but throwing is something that you do out of a closed posture with the elbow sort of staying closer to the body, typically, and the shoulder slot in. Right-handed people do open up their bodies to throw, but that's because in that activity, it's to their advantage to do it, right? So if we're looking for norms of handed behavior, we can say there's an overall dexteronorm to act like a right-handed person. And that means using space the way right-handed people use space, operating from a closed posture, except when it's advantageous for a right-handed person to use an open posture. And so you might be thinking, well, are there norms of handed behavior that are to the benefit of left-handed people? And the answer is no, never. I have never seen one. And when you do find something that looks like one, it's typically an accident. So, for example, the French horn. I'm left-handed, and I was like, "Hey, I'll play the French horn. That's cool." That was a middle school band. I did not stick with it. But what is going on with the French horn? You can see it's got the valves on the left side of the instrument, and the horn is on the right, and you play it by putting that right hand inside the bell of the horn where it's not doing a whole lot. This seems like an object that's designed for left-handed people, but it's not. The ancestor horn you played by modulating the tone of the instrument by putting your hand inside the bell. So when valve technology was invented in the early 19th century, they just stuck those keys on the left side so that would be out of the way of what the right hand was already doing. It's a historical accident that this thing is set up in a way that's sort of advantageous for left-handed people. Nothing is designed to benefit left-handers. And that tells us something about the extent of right hand bias. I've said this, but it's completely true. It's part of all handed activity all the time, everywhere. Your world is pervaded with right hand bias. Go look at anything right now, just anything you've got around you, anything around the house. Do you use a computer mouse when you're at home? It's set on the right side of your body, right? So imagine going to use a public computer in a library. That's where the mouse is, right? It's all set up for right-handed people so that they can flourish in their right-handed ways of being in the world. One more little bit of theory. Left and right are different. Obviously, you know the difference between left and right. I mean, maybe it's hard for you. Left-handed people are actually better at knowing the difference between left and right because they have to think about it more, right? But you know the difference. You know that they are different at least. But how can we distinguish left from right at all? Other animals don't really seem to be able to do that. And why is left right harder than top bottom or front back? This is a really interesting philosophical question. There's actually been quite a bit of work by different kinds of philosophers, especially people doing a kind of like analytic philosophy of science on this kind of topic. There are scientists who have tried to answer this question for 100 years. Ernst Mach, very into this question, actually. Well, I've got an answer for it. No one's had a sufficient answer yet. And part of it is asking the wrong question, right? We colloquially say, how do you know your left from your right? But there's at least three different kinds of things going on. There's an ontological thing where there are conditions for the possibility of distinguishing left from right. There's a perceptual thing where there's an ability to quote unquote tell the difference. And then there's an identification question, which is the conceptual naming of left as left and right as right. So, for example, I have someone in my life who consistently will tell you to turn right, but that person means turn left. She, she knows the difference. Right? She just mixes up the names, right? So that's another kind of question entirely. This chapter is long. This chapter gives a really technical argument. I designed this book so that you can skip chapters if you want to. If you are not into technical philosophy of science stuff or sort of classical phenomenology, this may not be the chapter for you. But I'll tell you here. You know what else is designed for skipping forward? Uh, YouTube clips. So, traditional phenomenology helps us get toward answers to this kind of question. So with Merleau-Ponty, you've got the body schematization stuff, the stuff about depth and maximum grip, how we use our bodies to orient us in the world so we can accomplish the things that we want. This is especially done through our front back asymmetry, right? Most of our perceptual stuff is set up to work best moving forward. Samuel Totis builds on this stuff. He talks more about movement than Merleau-Ponty does, how movement puts directionality into the body itself. Right? By moving forward, we establish front and back. It's not just a matter of how the body is set up, but how we move through the world. Ed Casey, in his work on place, talks about how asymmetries in the structure of body and world help us distinguish directions. Right? So that asymmetry in our perceptual apparatuses helps us fit into the world, but also stuff like gravity helps establish up and down, top and bottom of both world and body, right? So that's making these kinds of asymmetries, front, back, and top, bottom, sort of easier for us to figure out, right? With David Morris, whose work I love, uh, we get stuff about maximum grip and how this requires lateral asymmetry, right? That to get your maximum grip or hold on something in the world, you don't just grab it, you grab it with a particular hand. You use the hand that's most beneficial to you establishing that understanding. And it's not left or right, it's left or right, depending on how you situate yourself in the world. So, what does that tell us? That tells us that handedness is this ontological condition for the possibility of distinguishing left and right. It establishes a functional difference in how the body can approach the world that then allows perception of left and right and tightness of link between the percept and the concept, then gives us the identification stuff. But again, that's a distinct cognitive step. The science is really clear about that, which is why people get confused sometimes. People don't get confused about their fronts and backs of their bodies, right? Nobody ever says, "Oh, rub my chest," but they actually mean rub my back, right? That's like a very uncommon thing because we distinguish those things as we experience those things as so different. Left and right, we don't experience as differently as front and back, but the difference is still there. This is what allows the perception to be distinct, but at the same time, the identification to get a little cloudy, if that makes sense. So, the four really important things that I hope people take away at that point, right? That our typical concept of handedness is flawed, that the spatial orientation model corrects that flaw by allowing different handed comportments, and that right hand bias pervades everything, and that is asymmetrical experience is perceptual, not conceptual. It's rooted in the body's asymmetrical functioning in the body schema, right? So that gets us to the second half. We're really rolling through the book at this point, but we've just done this difficult chapter. So let's talk a little bit about something more fun. Let's talk about sports. You often see this sort of thing debated. Who's better at sports, right-handed people or left-handed people? Do left-handed people have special advantages? Well, there are basically two ways of talking about this in the literature, right? There's the idea that different handed people might have some sort of innate superiority. We know that the structure of the brain varies for left and right handed people. So you might think, well, because of that variance, maybe left handed people are better at something or right handed people are. There's no evidence for this position. The literature is really clear about it. Claire Porak, in her book, really explains those ideas well. Um, so then it's nurture, right? It's scarcity advantage or negative frequency dependent advantage, right? That left-handed people are very used to playing against right-handed people. Right-handed people are not as used to playing against left-handed people. So left-handed people have an advantage. If that's true, then we should see a higher than normal percentage of left-handed people in sports. If they have this advantage, then there should be more of them, right? The equilibrium shouldn't be at 10%. It should be something more. We'll see about that. Uh, I'm giving a third kind of model, one rooted in body schematization, that if we really want to understand distribution of handedness in sports, that it depends on how those left and right-handed body comportments situate people in the world to do things, right? And if that open posture of the left-hander or the closed posture of the right-hander is more beneficial, depending on the sport. And to be honest, there's a lot of variance across lots of different sports. Left-handed people are, uh, for reasons I sort of talk about in my book, better at fencing than right-handed people are. But in general, let's stick to sort of major American sports. And let's focus on throwing. We all love throwing sports. About 10% of men throw left-handed. And that's really what we're going to look at here is left-handed men who throw. Because that's honestly where we have the best data. I tried really hard in the construction of this book to find like accurate WNBA data for handedness, and it was very hard. And it would have taken honestly quite a bit more work than I was willing to do. With the men, it was on everybody's player card on like stat reference. So apologies. Whoever would like to take up this project further, I would love to hear variation across gender and so on because it exists. I know that for sure. I just don't know what it is. All right. So let's talk about NFL football. We're looking for 10% or more of players being left-handed, and we're looking at quarterbacks because those are the ones who throw. And they're not there. There are only two left-handed Hall of Fame quarterbacks. I will leave that for you to figure out who they are. There were no left-handed quarterbacks in the NFL at all from 2016 to 2020. And why is that? Well, because throwing a football is a right-handed motion among other explanations. But when you throw a ball, it's you keep that elbow really in and that wrist straight so that you can bring the ball forward in the right way. There's a similar story in NBA basketball. Left-handed people are about 5 to 7% of the league, less than 10 to 15. And in particular, left-handers are weaker shooters. Only about four of the top free throw and three-point percentage shooters of all time are left-handed shooters, where you would again expect higher numbers. If you think about it, you can probably figure out which ones there are. And there are other metrics. You can look at scoring and things like that. But this is going to be explanatory, right? To stick around in the NBA, you have to be able to score the basketball, and shooting a basketball is a right-handed motion with that elbow tucked in, bringing that wrist back in order to effectively manipulate the ball. But looking at throwing in Major League Baseball, left-handers are about 30% of pitchers, right? So what's going on here? Is throwing a baseball left-handed motion? No, obviously not. Is being left-handed and throwing an advantage? Well, this is a yes and no. So left-handers throw worse by almost all measurables, and if you know about baseball, you know that they like are able now to measure all kinds of different things when you're talking about it. So uh, they throw slower, their velocity's worse, all these kinds of things. So why are there so many of them? Why is that equilibrium at 30 instead of 10? The answer seems to be cognitive confusion. So, in seasons where left-handers throw more innings, right-handed pitchers have better ERAs than when there are more right-handers throwing. What's going on there? Well, it seems like if you mix up the pitching, if in the first inning they're seeing a right-handed pitcher, and then in the fourth they're seeing a left-handed pitcher, and then in the eighth they're seeing a right-handed pitcher, it's harder over the course of a game for the batters to be able to lock in on what's going on. So what really matters is just the variety of pitching, not the handedness of the pitchers, at least in this case. So look, if you would like me to consult for your professional football or basketball franchise, I am open to a conversation. But here's the basics, right? If you want to be an NFL quarterback and be left-handed, you've got to have the whole organization helping you out, being able to move everybody in the right ways, design plays for you. And I've also suggested that you could bring in left-handers as like pinch throwers. This is something that we actually see sometimes in football that's pretty effective, where you might hand the ball off to a running back who's left-handed, and then that person surprisingly throws a pass. It's very difficult to defend against something like that. In the NBA, if you want to be left-handed and play basketball, first of all, be tall. The taller you are, the worse you can be with your hands, because height is a very valuable trait. Focus on defense. Being able to move laterally is something that left-handed people are sort of better at than right-handed people because of that, uh, well, sort of more symmetry in using left and right. And learn how to shoot right-handed. So Larry Bird and LeBron James, two of the greatest scorers of all time, are what you might call naturally left-handed people. They do all other things with their left hands, but they shoot with their right hands. So try a different hand, right? That's really fun. Now it's going to get a little darker, right? So chapter six, how do we talk about intersections of handed norms and other social norms? And honestly, this is hard to talk about because there's not a lot of data. Um, if you have like left-handed people who are 10% of the population, you've got intersex people who are, between less than one and maxing out at two, depending on how you're sort of carving up the data. And so if you're trying to find like intersex left-handed people, you've got like tiny data sets that you're trying to work with. Some people have done some meta studies though, and using those, we can try to talk a little bit about how norms of sort of sexuality and gender and handedness intersect. So here are some things we know for sure. We know for sure that women are much more likely to be right-handed than men are. I prefer the gender terms here. The people who do the research mix the language of sex and gender all the time. It's something you just have to deal with. Um, Here's another thing we know. Heterosexuals, especially women, are much more likely to be right-handed than non-heterosexuals. So you're gay and lesbian, men and women actually are much more likely to be left-handed than heterosexual people are. And honestly, I spent a lot of time shifting through data that talks about non-right-handed, non-heterosexuals, and it is tiring. But in order to aggregate data sets, that's just what people have to do. And again, let's hope in the future people don't have to do that, right? That we can get better empirical studies of these populations. But again, it's hard. Uh, so just understanding that and some of what happens in this chapter is necessarily sort of speculative because of the data it relies on. But I think that we've got pretty strong positions here. So call this position Knight norms of intersecting gender and handedness theory. What are these norms? Well, maybe you've read Iris Young on the feminine body comportment and the masculine body comportment. The recent science on this stuff actually backs up these ideas. So, if you're in that camp of thinking, well, Iris Young's work is probably really outdated when she describes that closed body posture of feminine movement and then the large, coordinated, sort of active movement of the masculine body comportment. Recent science shows that these things are still gendered, right? That women are far more likely to operate in closed body postures than men are, and far less likely to coordinate the physical strength of their gross muscles than men do. So, just facts about that. I've talked about the right handed body comportment, closed except when it's useful to be open, left handed body comportment, using both sides of the body in an open posture, and then dexteronormativity, right? That people are required to act like a right hander by inhabiting space the way right handed people do, regardless of your handedness. So, if we just think about what these norms look like on the face of them, what would we predict? Well, we would predict that handedness and gender norms are more constraining for women than men because they both point in this direction of having a closed body. What about talking about sexuality? Well, there's this close cultural alignment between right-handedness and heterosexuality. And so being non-right-handed or being non-heterosexual are both sort of deviations from a right-handed heteronormative sort of ideal type. And this is pretty clear when we look at the data that we have, that nature explanations for why women would be more right-handed than men don't work. So you have to have other kinds of explanations. All right. Uh, this gives us a model with explanatory power. It predicts that there will be more right-handed women, and there are more right-handed women. It predicts that there will be more right-handed heterosexual people, and there are more right-handed heterosexual people. Right? So, like, a right-handed closed posture represents a sort of feminine ideal type, the small, demure woman, right? Open postures are perceived as masculine. They're a transgression of that type. Left-handedness is an open posture, so it's a deviation from that type. Right? People who are less bound by that sort of norm are going to be freer to operate in masculine and left-handed postures. And there are some actually pretty interesting studies on that topic, though again, small numbers. And then I use the example in the book of like the quarterback of the team who's right this uh, ideal type. He's athletic, he's right-handed, he's heterosexual, and all the ways that these things get sort of bunched together, right? So a deviation from one of those things is a deviation from the ideal type. I can tell you, having grown up as a left-handed person, that I was subject to slur and sexual-based slurs because of being left-handed. This is a common way that this stigma shows up in Western cultures. So uh, that chapter, I think, is really promising in thinking about how handedness and gender stereotype run together. And so then we might be worried about, well, how deep do these harms of handedness go? How harmful is it to be left-handed? Are left-handed people oppressed? That seems like a weird question to ask. I know it seems like a weird question to ask. So Here's how I put this chapter together. I do a lot of feminist philosophy. That's one of my things. So I took some of the sort of primary frameworks that have historically been used in feminist philosophy and asked, well, do left-handed people fit in these frameworks? So if we take like Marilyn Frye's classic accounting of things and the birdcage example, where she explains that individual harms don't have to be huge, they just have to be systematic and bad, right? And in fact, that sounds a lot like what we would get for left-handed people, right? Left-handed people don't subject are not subject to like huge, terrible harms, right? People, at least in the West, right, are not going to be raped and killed because they're left-handed, but they're subject to sort of systematic harms every day as they comport themselves in a right-handed world. Deanna Myers talks about different kinds of autonomy. Uh, and one of the ideas that she's trying to get at in this conversation, which I really find insightful, right, is being able to talk about how there can be harms that hinder your competence and skills in being autonomous, even when you think you're doing fine. Right. So she talks about traditional women who have grown up in sexist societies and how they limit their options and what they choose for their lives. But to them, they're making choices all the time about what's good and not good for them and their families and so on. They don't recognize that their autonomy is compromised in some way. So similarly, left-handed people don't have political action groups. They don't rabble rouse about being oppressed, right? But that doesn't mean that their autonomy isn't compromised in some way. Iris Young, in her Faces of Oppression work, talks about how harm can take different forms for different groups. This is important to think about. She talks about five. Left-handed people might fit according to some of those and not others, but you don't have to fit every kind of oppression to count as being oppressed, right? And then with Ann Cudd's sort of analytic definition of oppression, uh, apologies for saying this like so briefly, right? Unjustified coercion brings about harm that benefits one social group over another. That's the basics of how she talks about oppression. And we think, well, maybe, yeah, right? Right-handed people are benefiting, left-handed people are being harmed. It's an unjustified coercion because it's not a matter of fairness for everything to be right-handed. There might be some questions about whether left-handed people constitute a social group in the right way, which is a really interesting question, right? I love to talk about that kind of stuff. But just looking preliminarily at these four frameworks, it looks like left-handed people fit, right? At least it's not an absurd question if left-handers are oppressed, right? It's the kind of thing that deserves study. And the real question is, are left-handed people subject to serious systematic harm? We know in the past, of course, this is true. We know in other places, this is certainly true. Um, I'll talk more about this in a second, probably, but left-handed people are stigmatized all over the place in the West through the use of language, through how they're selected in empirical studies and things like that. In other places, it's worse. There are cultures in Africa where if a child starts to display left-handedness, they will burn that hand up in boiling water so that they can't use the left hand. There are other places where it's, more or less extreme, predominantly Muslim countries where there's strong taboos against using the left hand or using it only for specific sort of gross purposes. Uh, what the data tells us is there's a slightly negative characterization of left-handed people in the biological literature, right? There's a lot of research that asks if left-handedness is a negative trait in some manner. You see all kinds of studies like, are left-handed people more likely to be criminals? Are left-handed people more likely to be schizophrenic? Are left-handed people more likely to be pedophiles? And so on. That's some bias going into the research, right? You never see a paper that says, are right-handed people more likely to be criminals, right? No one asks that kind of question. Throughout, right-handedness is considered normal. Uh, my favorite study, this is from 2014, Willems in their research group, argue that left-handed people's brains fall within the normal spectrum of brains and therefore ought to be included in brain studies because they're not. Left-handed people's brains are systematically excluded from data collection, let alone study, when it comes to brain studies. There was a follow-up study a couple of years ago that showed that norms have not changed since the Willems meta study. So, like I said, We really don't know what left-handed people are like. We don't study their bodies. We don't study their brains. So we have to look closer at dextronormativity. We have to look closer at the kinds of harms that happen from people who aren't allowed to use their body schemas in ways that are fruitful. There are really extreme studies, right, of people who are in prisons, things like that. But left-handed people aren't in prisons, right? Um, when my grandfather was growing up, he was forcibly converted to being right-handed, right? His school teachers bound his hand. Uh, we don't use physical violence to forcibly convert left-handed people into being right-handed anymore, at least where I live. So are left-handed people oppressed? Honestly, we don't know. This is the kind of thing that needs a lot more study. We know that they're not oppressed like other paradigmatically oppressed peoples that we can think of now or historically. But that doesn't mean there's not a problem. And I think that's a really useful distinction, right? Even if left-handed people are not oppressed, there's still a problem here. And it's a hard problem to talk about, but there's some really promising avenues. So, in the last chapter of the book, I talk about politics of handedness, right? All human societies are dextronormative. All human societies are 90% right-handed, right? So, what would liberation look like for left-handed people? Well, here's what it looks like right now. I love Linda Alcoff's work on visible identity. Left-handed people are an invisible identity, right? Even invisible to themselves. Most left-handed people don't think of being left-handed as a primary identity feature. Although, if you ask people, list 10 identity features about yourself, left-handed people are more likely to list it. Not super likely, but are more likely. Right-handed people never list being right-handed as an identity condition, even though it is their basic mode of being in the world, confronting the world, bringing it into proximity, understanding it, manipulating it, and so on. Anyway, race and gender, as we typically think of them, are visible or most likely visible, right? Handedness isn't really, and no one's policing it. I mean, I can look at people and judge pretty well if they're left or right-handed, but that's because this is my job, right? This is what I look for. Your average person has no idea. Left-handedness is pretty normal in comparison to 100 years ago, right? Left-handed people aren't stigmatized the way they used to be. This also means no one's really paying attention, right? And so the left-handed population is small, it's unrecognized. So, what sorts of intersectional strategies might benefit left-handed people? And this is where I found some stuff in the literature that I was not expecting. Fact, the more conservative, authoritarian, and xenophobic a group is, the more right-handed it is. I think that's stunning. This is true of countries when you look at different indices that measure these things. This is also true in the United States. The more liberal a state is, the more left-handers there are by percentage. There are more left-handed people by percentage in California than there are in Kansas. It is a perfect correlation in the McCann study. This is just shocking, right? Just like shocking. Uh, the more sexist and unequal a society is, the more right-handed it is. Right-handedness indicates a less just, less tolerant world. Right-handed worlds are more conservative, more authoritarian, more xenophobic, more unequal, more sexist. Wow, right? So promoting left-handedness becomes, here, come conspire with me, right? Promoting left-handedness becomes a mode of progressive liberalization. Left-handedness can be a kind of Trojan horse, right? So uh, we know it's not a natural difference. People in mainland China are less than 1% left-handed. Second generation Chinese Americans are 10% left-handed, right? There's something that's going on in repression that trickles all the way down to handedness. And look, it's really hard to liberalize a society in terms of sexism, in terms of sexual liberalization in general, right? It's just really hard. but it's not as hard to get people to be less repressive of left-handed people. People can pretty well understand that these sorts of things are unjust. You can track sort of negative things that happen to people if you're forcing them to be left-handed. Left-handed people are a bellwether of open, liberal, tolerant societies. So what happens if we go to these places and we can't get them to be less sexist, but we convince them to ease up on left-handed people? Well, what you're effectively doing is saying there's more freedom of bodily movement, open postures, individuality. We're making more space for those kinds of things. And if you're making more space for open postures, like I was saying earlier, you're making more space for women to use open postures. You're making more space for sexual minorities who don't conform to the closed postures of right-handedness. So I think that we can make a strong causal case for left-handedness as a Trojan horse for liberation in a more general way. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it's going to open a crack, right? And that's the sort of thing we're always looking for. How do we just open up a crack in some authoritarian place to a more liberal world, right? So that's where the book ends. This idea that we can think of left-handedness as liberation, right? That if we follow through on the findings in this book, that we could make a tremendous positive difference for oppressed people everywhere. Open up those bodies, use them freely the way you want to. To live and live well, we must understand handedness. I've got some sources here also. If you want to check in on those are the things that really I quoted directly in here. Of course, the book has a huge index in it. But that's where I am in this research with the book just recently published. I'm the only one. There are so many alternatives, so many pathways that can be followed if we want to think really seriously and clearly about handedness, which again is the fundamental way that we, through a physical lateral asymmetry, gear ourselves into the world to accomplish the things we want to do and also to play. I'm done. That was a lot to say. Thank you so much. Again, if you want to get in touch with me, I am Peter Westmoreland. The slide with my identifying information is at the beginning of this clip. Thanks, everybody. Have an awesome, awesome day.